Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writing for Roleplay, a tabletop RPG podcast. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Kayla.
So, our first episode, we talked about tabletop RPGs in general, and the different layers of storytelling you have to think of when crafting narratives in tabletop RPGs, whether you're a GM, a player, professional writer, actual play performer, whatever. Episode 2, we talked about the different genres of tabletop role-playing games. We suggested a few different tabletop role-playing games that people can play and try out and see if that's their thing. We also went on a wide tangent on identifying the genre that you're working with, as well as the trappings of that genre that, you know, maybe you don't want to import into your game blindly. Maybe you want to think about them a little bit before, you know, playing out these scenarios. So we started off broad. And now we're going to focus in a little bit on some more actionable writing for roleplay advice. And that is actually the theme of this episode: world building and scope. The broader details, the details that fill out your world, and the scope of, all right, what is the A to B to C outline, flowchart? What is the main goal in front of your party that they want to accomplish in the narrative? So I'm very excited to talk about this.
Yeah, so I think world building is something that a lot of newer GMs kind of might be intimidated by, because when we think, especially in the fantasy and sci-fi genres, as most roleplay games are set in, you think world building, you start thinking like Tolkien and Frank Herbert, and that's a pretty intimidating standard to set yourself against. So I think hopefully this episode will give people some very actionable advice on world building if they feel intimidated by it, or like they could use a little bit of help. Or maybe you are a huge world builder and part of your problem is world building maybe a little bit too much for a tabletop game, and you're unsure of where you're supposed to pull back, or, you know, it could be all very overwhelming world building, whether you like it or hate it.
Oh, yeah, and I think this is why world building and scope kind of go in hand, and why I want to talk about, you know, both of them at the same time. Because I have been at tables where the GM is very interested in the broader world building, like, oh, here's all these different factions, here's their flags, here's the outline of like the nations and the borders and the agricultural systems and all these different like cultural stuff. And it's like, wow, this is a really in-depth, very detailed world, but we have nothing to do. We do not have the goal in front of us. And I've also been at tables where the GM just thought about like, all right, they're going to go here, they're going to accept a quest, and they're going to kill a monster. And then if you actually try to pry into any other bit of the world, they don't have an answer for you. Like, I've played a game where, you know, we're in town and the GM's like, there's a bounty board. I'm like, cool, I want to check out the bounty board. And they're like, oh, I didn't think about what to put on the bounty board. I'm like, then why have the bounty board there?
Yeah, you got to be careful. You know, when you mention stuff, players are instantly like, ooh, what's that? You know, because from my perspective, if you mention it, my thought as a player, as a character in this world, if you mention it, that is like when you're watching an episode of Scooby-Doo and one of the books is animated on a different layer than all of the other books on the shelf. You're supposed to go touch it. So when GMs, watch out, like when you mention stuff like that, be prepared for your players to go poking at that different animation cell. Because yeah, if you mention a bounty board, I want to go check out all of the bounties. Who's going to be the coolest or most profitable bounty to go hunt? So be careful about throwing up stuff that you're not prepared for. Otherwise, you might have to improv real fast. And I think it'll be good. We can kind of talk a little bit, too, in this episode about tools that are very helpful for adventure building on the fly a little bit, or when just things that you might want to have on deck. Because when we talk about world building and thinking out all of these parts of your world, there are going to be some things where it's like, well, that might not really be relevant, or like that might be relevant. And it might be good to have some tools on deck to quickly throw things together if needed, or just some general reference points if you have to start improving real fast about something.
Mm-hmm. So when GMing and crafting a narrative, you have to think on a few separate layers, which that's going to be something that I'm going to hit on again and again in the series, is how many different layers you have to think on while crafting narratives.
It's 4D chess.
Exactly. You have to think about the broader world building, But you also have to get more specific and think about the A to B to C adventure outline. You also have to think about the game mechanics to explore both, as well as the real world schedule you have with your group. If your group cannot meet up that much, you should probably think of a shorter story. If your group regularly meets up, though, then you have more freedom to, have longer storylines, to mess around a bit, and to really add some detail in your world, because you also have the time for your players to explore it.
If you meet more regularly, it's going to be easier for your players to remember all of these different aspects of the world, rather than having to like dig through notes from months ago during session, 3, when you threw out this incredible, we'll use this tool later, and then you wait for the reveal and session 10, but session 10's like a year later, and you reveal this cool super neat little plot twist, and all of the players are like, what? Did we learn about that? Because it's been so long. And some people maybe take good notes, and some people maybe don't take great notes, and some people maybe review them ahead of time, and maybe some people don't. It's a game. So, yeah, if you can't meet that often, being a little light and loose, I think is going to be a lot easier on everybody, rather than expecting, a once every 2-month party to be able to keep track of a Tolkien level cultural world building that's happening and laying out all of these things for your players. These clues, it may not work as well, simply because they just don't have time to invest in it, and they can't remember it because it's been so long ago.
It's interesting because
sometimes I mean, the things that I write down, I take goodish notes. I think I tend to be one of the stronger note takers in my groups, typically, because I was that kind of student. And yet, sometimes my notes are just all of the cool lines that everybody said. And it's not necessarily something that was super relevant. Sometimes I miss things entirely.
But that is like a kind of player, too. Like, there are players who take extensive notes because what they get out of the game is the world building exploration. It's like, oh, I want to go into a place and I want to learn about its history. I want to learn about like the interesting people there. I want to learn about like the factional conflicts. Like, they really want to dig into the lore. And on the flip side, there are the kinds of players who are just like, I'm just here to, have my barbarian go into a dungeon and hit something for 100 damage.
What's in front of me? What's directly in front of me right now that I can hit or buy or steal or whatever?
Yeah. Broad, specific. So let's start out broad, and let's start with world building tips. So first world building tip that we have, once again, know your genre. Depending on the genre of game that you're playing will determine like how much world building thought you need to put into this. If you're playing small town monster romance, then you really only need to think about, the small town, the name of the school that they go to, or like some of the local businesses there. And then it's really just filling out like the people of the town. And that's the majority of your world building. But if you're doing a galaxy-wide space opera, suddenly you have a lot more to think about, such as, like the different alien races if you have aliens, or the different colonies. What's the level of technology? Do we have spaceships? Do we have teleportation? Do we have like advanced medical cloning? Do we have time travel, God forbid?
Yeah.
If you're in an entirely different world, you do have to think about the world building of that world.
I'm sorry, I got stuck on time travel, and then I was thinking about what a hot mess that would be. There are definitely games that have time loop mechanics and things like that. Or time travel mechanics.
There was a Dungeons & Dragons campaign that we ran where, like, at a certain point you can mess with a magical artifact, and then like one of the things that can happen messing with the magical artifact is all the players just go back to the beginning of the module. And by this point we're at like session 40 or something like that. So that was just not a realistic option that we were going to do. But like that
Descent into Avernus?
That was Out of the Abyss.
Out of the Abyss, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Minor potential spoilers for Out of the Abyss. But yeah, it's like an official option published in the module was going back to the beginning. And it's like, we're not doing that.
We almost fucked with that, right? And then we didn't?
Almost.
Yeah. And then you told us later, good thing you didn't fuck with that. And we were horrified. I think one of the big things with world building is everything is kind of a cause and effect in the real world. And so when you're thinking about like the most important aspects of your world building, like the big broad strokes, just think down that cause and effect chain a little bit. Like, okay, if we're on an island and thus there's like a strong kind of navy and fishing presence, well, what does that mean for this like island nation? Because if you look at other island nations in the real world, like England and Japan, they tend to also have, at some point in their history, if not for large swaths of their history, a tendency to do colonization as a means of getting resources, because they are on a small contained island. There's only so much land, and population tends to go up when a country is doing well. Then you need resources. And that's part of the reason that Japan and England, as examples, turned to colonization, was because they needed resources for their countries. That's why they did it. That's why they were justifying it. And that's not, that's a fact of life, of world building. Like, if you're going to have an island nation, how is this island nation supporting its population? Not every island nation turned to empire building. There's plenty of islands in the Pacific that never turned to massive empire building the way that England and Japan did. Well, why? And you can look into, take a look at a couple of real world countries' histories and think, okay, well, was this an island population that stayed kind of small? Was it really isolated, so it wasn't super easy to get places, so it never really got into travel and exploration as extensively? And I'm simplifying things a little bit here, people. I understand I'm being like very broad, very general, simplifying, but that's kind of where you want to start, is thinking about, well, if I'm making a country, if my nation is kind of like ancient Italy, is it behaving similar to how ancient Italy behaved, or is it behaving differently, and like why isn't this country on the war path with its neighbors? Is there some sort of peace treaty? Is it like mutually assured destruction? Is it that both of those countries have adequate resources and they don't need to do anything? Because most wars are about power, and power is really about resources, like who has resources and who doesn't. So if you're playing a game, a fantasy game or space opera where the backdrop of war is happening, you should think about why certain factions are fighting each other, because it's never really going to be as simple as these people are evil. They want to conquer for a reason, and you can make it like a very blatant sort of, they're a militaristic nation that worships a war god that idolizes battle, and the way you get into heaven is by fighting in wars and conquering. Like, you can do that, but also people usually don't want to go die for nothing. So either that has to be something that's really ingrained in the culture, like this religious zealotry of you have to fight to get into Valhalla or heaven or whatever. There's going to be people that don't really want to do that. Or maybe it's partially like, that's the kind of the justification, and really what we're after here is like resources. Like, taxes historically have not always been money. They have been pounds of rice or pounds of wheat. So that's just something to like think about when you're thinking about the big moving engines of this world. These large countries that might be at war, why are they at war with each other? Or if they're not, and again, if they're not at war, then why are they at peace? What happened?
I kind of like that angle that you're talking about with like going into historical societies. Like, if you are modeling a world after older Italy, like it would help your world building to actually do research on what society was like back then. Like, what was the level of technology like how did people go about their day and day? Or if you're making a tribe that is like loosely based off of like Mongolian hordes, like reading about the the Mongols and their culture and their technology. And you shouldn't do a one-to-one, because that can lead to some other stuff, but going into history to find world building tips is a great source of inspiration for this sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's an interesting way to make things kind of, or it's like an easy way to make things complex. Like the Mongol hordes were pretty notorious for their conquest, but also in the wake of that conquest, we got the Silk Road and this influx of like trading and peace along that Silk Road because the Mongols were able to hold that. And thus, you had this exchange between the Far East and the Near West, if you will. And that's a pretty good thing. And does it justify all of the dead bodies? You know, the scales are. It's complicated. Like, no, people shouldn't die, but also, like, there are good things that came out of it. So, you know, when you're creating these like factions and antagonists, it's easy to fall into traps of, well, they're just evil and it's all bad. And it's like, well, no, not necessarily. I mean, the Vikings were famous for being brutal murderers and raiders, but also they cleaned themselves pretty frequently. They had what we might call slightly more gender equality than typical. Like women were in charge of like finances. They had a lot of autonomy within their home. That didn't really stop Viking raider men from raping and pillaging all of the, you know, Welsh and Irish and English women in the towns that they went to. But you know, like things are complex. Don't be afraid to make things a little complex. And also, you don't have to have like racism and sexism or whatever in your world. You can eliminate that if you want.
And at the same time, you know, you can deal with those topics as well in your game, especially if you want to, you know, explore that kind of thing. You can find inspiration from the genre you're working in. You can find inspiration from looking at historical cultures, and especially looking at historical cultures, there's a lot of inspiration to find ways to make your world more complex. As you were saying, Kayla, like you can have a warrior nation who worship like a warrior god and loves conquest, but you can also like look at, you know, the Mongolians or the Vikings or whatever other, you know, conqueror nation throughout history, because there's always a new one, and see like the other bits of their culture that actually like flesh them out and make them real people. I think one other tip that I would give for world building is that, you know, and we mentioned this earlier in the episode, there's a proclivity to be paralyzed by world building because you think you need to come up with the entire world. Like, oh, I need a full map with trade routes and every building mapped out and how the agriculture works and how every single piece of technology works and how, like, you think you need to map out literally everything when you really don't. You mentioned earlier a like cause and effect kind of thing, and you were referring more to like how history is sort of a cause and effect, but it also made me think about how I do a lot of world building, which is I'll build the world that I need to build. It's less of like mapping out an open territory for me and more like digging tunnels. You know? Like I'm creating a system of like interconnecting things that all like fit together, but at the same time, like if my players are like, hey, we need to go to the bank, just throwing out a random example, it's like, all right, I now need to build out like what's the name of the bank, does the society even have banks? Or, you know, going on to like a more serious example here, you know, you mentioned like, all right, we want to have an adventure that's on an island. Now you have to think about like, all right, what is this island? And also, what will the adventures be? Are the adventure or adventures going to be focused primarily on this island? And if so, you need to fill out that island and figure out like, all right, what are the different parts of this island? Are there any legends? What's the terrain? Is there like a big mountain in the center? What's the towns like? But also, you know, if they are an island nation, think about what is the level of technology. Like if you're going to have adventures that are off of the island, you then need to think about what's the boating technology like? Does the party already have a boat, or do they need to buy a boat? And if so, what is the currency? What is, how cheap or affordable is it or expensive it is to buy a boat or charter transportation to go to all these different places? It is the, okay, I want the party to go here, so I have to think about what is here.
Yeah, I think, and the other thing too, when you get into economy or whatever, religion is a big part of world building. Economy and religion may be tied together. So is the religious orders, are they rich? Are they poor? That can affect their influence. The Catholic Church is probably the richest entity in the entire world, and it's very influential. and has been throughout history. So do you have is your world dominated by a very influential religious order? Or is it a less influential, perhaps more poor religious order that's maybe not as hierarchical? It doesn't have as big of an influence in politics. It's a bit more maybe individualistic instead of a larger organization. How does that affect stuff? And one of the other things too to think about when looking at religions, there's systems might come with preordained gods.
The deities in 5e, yeah, no, there are so many different deities in 5e. There's so many different pantheons because they not only just grabbed a bunch of different pantheons from like world cultures, like Thor is technically canon within, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but also they keep bringing forth all the pantheons from like older editions or other campaign settings, just kind of putting them into a smorgasbord of different gods.
Yeah, so you can do a grab bag of pre-existing deities to make canon in your world, or if you're making up your own. One of my little bits of advice for you would be, well, what is important to the people?
Mm-hmm.
Because what's important to their lives is what they deify. So, for example, the ancient Greeks were sailors. They were it's an island nation, basically. I mean, it's a peninsula with a whole bunch of islands, and they were big into sailing, so Poseidon is an incredibly powerful god in their pantheon. However, sailing can be dangerous, and thus Poseidon is also a very dangerous and persnickety god in their pantheon. He is the antagonist of the Odyssey, but the Greeks would never not worship Poseidon just because he was the antagonist in the Odyssey, because he represents the force of nature that is the sea. He is vital and he is dangerous. So that's kind of like the Greek gods in particular, I think, have personalities that represent themselves as forces of nature that they represent. Zeus is the sky. The sky rules above all of us. It gives us rain and sunlight, and also thunderstorms. It's destructive. He's the god of kings. Kings can be good and just, or they could be fickle and violent, and Zeus is like that. So you need to think when you're building this, for example, island nation, okay, well, the sea is probably pretty important to them if they use it to travel. Perhaps the sea's a bit more benevolent. If it's something that isolates them, maybe they're afraid of it. And is it a volcanic island? Is there a volcano? How do they feel about the volcano? It's probably pretty destructive, but also I think volcanoes can be very... I did not take geology in college. I took astronomy. But they, like the soil, I think it's good for the soil, right? Like the volcano does create the island. Is there a war god? How influential is war in this nation? Gods of riches, things like that. Mm-hmm. Agriculture, if it's a very farm heavy, like the characters that are farmers, they're probably going to care more about the god of agriculture over characters that are, leading political leaders. They might care about gods of wisdom or gods of wealth or gods of war more.
Mm-hmm. And you're focusing mostly on religion, but it touches back on the digging out the bits of world building that you need method, where if you have a player who, going back to a Dungeons and Dragons example, like if you have a player who's a cleric, think about how does religion and divinity work in this world. If you have a character who is playing a different race, think about what is that race's, place in this current world. If you have a character who is part of a warriors guild, think about what is, that warriors guild place in this world. Is there an NPC you can create to better represent the warriors guild in this world? Mm-hmm. Your players will create characters that will then fill out the world by their existence. Yeah. And one of the best things about tabletop RPGs is that cooperative storytelling of I want to make a character that's this, and the DM being like, okay, how does this fit in this world?
Yeah, if you have somebody who wants to play, for existence, one of my earlier D&D characters was I wanted to play background noble because they got the most amount of money to start with. So I was like, okay, she's a noble, but why would a noble go adventuring? I don't know, maybe I liked Zuko's character arc a lot when I was a kid, how he was like a wandering exiled noble. maybe we'll do something like that. But maybe instead of being exiled, well, I want to play a warlock. Warlocks look cool. They have like this inbuilt story thing where they have a whole dynamic with their patron. And the other reason I wanted to play a warlock was I was interested in magic, but the wizard seemed kind of intimidating for me to play for like the first time, so I picked warlock. So I was thinking, okay, well, she's noble, she's a warlock. I like the fiend one because that skill set looks coolest to me. Okay, so how do you be a noble? You live a comfortable life and you make a pact with the devil. Well, why? Why do you make a pact with the devil? Why are you adventuring? Why are you noble? Oh, well, maybe your entire family died. Maybe you were a noble and everybody got killed in like a war because you were a powerful family, so they targeted your family. There was some sort of invasion in the castle. You escaped, made a pact with Asmodeus for power so that you could get revenge. And that was all just because I liked these mechanics. So then I thought about why, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in character building, but it's the same thing with world building, because then I presented this to the DM and the DM had to be like, okay, what is this conflict that happened that your character died in? And I said noble, and she came back and was like, you are the last remaining princess of the country that we're in. And I was like, oh, okay. Yes, and that, that shifted how she was interacting with these rebels, because she went from being just like, when we started, she went from just being like some sort of noble. I was thinking maybe a minor noble, and my DM went back and was like, let's just make you the princess. I was like, okay. And that affected how the character interacted with the world around her, what the character thought even of this conquering force that had come through the nation. It was less of just like, you killed my entire family. It's now you've stolen my country from me. And then this campaign, it was one of those, campaigns that you never finish. But there was conversation about like, well, why did this conquering nation come through and completely usurp this country and kill all of these people? That was definitely a plot thread that we were running towards, of what's going on, what's this larger mechanic. So that, that's just kind of an example of the things that your players will bring you, and then you can kind of add on and glom onto and build together a Play-Doh castle of conflict and motivation and a real world. And that's the thing, world building should be, when you world build, don't worry about making a giant Wikipedia encyclopedia so much. It's more of everything that you world build should be something that the players can touch and interact with. That's the stuff that you want to pour the most energy into. First and foremost is what the characters are going to play with.
Yeah, it's that thought of like finding that core idea of something you like and then extrapolating from there. Real quick, on the flip side to, creating a character and then building out the world building that way, as a GM, you should also feel comfortable to say no, but because I've also certainly run games. Like, I try to tell my players before, we start a campaign, like, hey, here's like a 1-page sheet of like the world and what we're going to be hitting and like the homebrew rules that we're using or whatever. But I have also had players who would come up to me and be like, hey, I want to play a cyborg cat person. And I'm just like, that's just not going to work. That just can't fit in. Please choose another character.
Pocket that one for another. Pocket that one for another game. I will get to it, but that's very incongruous, and we'll talk about this more in crafting your character. But I will say, I'm a big fan of kind of the outside in approach of what I call with character building. Whereas I do ask Kevin, hey, what's going on? What can you tell me so that I can build a character around it? Like, usually I'll know kind of maybe what class I want to play, and then I'll go to Kevin and it'll be like, tell me some stuff, and then I'll build it back from that. But yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But the world building is important to character building, in my opinion.
Yeah. And going back to that, like finding the core idea and extrapolating from there, this is why I think that world building and scope go hand in hand. Because as I said at the beginning of this episode, the scope of what you're doing is going to influence how much world building you can afford to put in. And you really do need to think about the scope of your game and what you're trying to get out of it before you go into the wider details of filling out the space. So, a lot of people, especially playing like Dungeons and Dragons, are now used to these large, expanding epics that can be like 30 to 50 sessions. At least that's how like the
Or more.
Yeah, or more. At least that's how like the published modules kind of infer it. Like we have played like 3 separate modules, just you and me, Kayla, like in our group. And, you know, Out of the Abyss, Descent to Avernus, Curse of Strahd, all of those took us between like 30 to 50 sessions, if not more.
Oh yeah, they were, and in real time they took, I think, almost on average about 2 years at least.
Yeah. And we had irregular times when we could meet, of course, just because our schedules wouldn't align sometimes.
I will say though, there were stretches of time there where we were meeting every single week for a couple of months at a time. And then yeah, there'd be times where it stretched out longer. But I think Out of the Abyss was over 50 sessions, and that was something where we were meeting like 2 to 4 times a month most of the campaign.
Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the standard that's been set with D&D 5th edition and a little bit with the previous editions, but a lot of adventures can be one-shots, or they can be like 4 sessions, or it's like, hey, this is a big dungeon, I'm thinking probably like 8 sessions or something like that. Like, it does not have to be a wide-spanning epic for these adventures. And in fact, a lot of other games that aren't Dungeons and Dragons work like that.
Yeah.
You can actually have like full stories in like 2 sessions if you wanted.
But with D&D specifically, though, a lot of the modules are fixated on, you know, 10 levels or whatever of character growth or more, long epic campaigns. They do have some modules that are kind of anthology modules where they're basically collections of 1 or 2 shots that you could play all of them in a successive order of the same party and it's all connected, or you could just play them as one shots and jump around a little bit. Or and there's also lots of out on the internet, there's tons of mini campaigns and one shots and things like that. So if you're intimidated by starting with a homebrew of some kind, you know, if you're doing a one shot and you're like, oh geez, this is like my first time GMing, I don't really know what to do, I don't know how much to do, like we're only gonna play like 1, 2, 3 sessions or whatever, you don't have to pick up Out of the Abyss. You can go to one of the anthology modules, or you could go online and find something. I've done that. And if you want to kind of build on it, you can build on it. You know, there's lots of resources out there too that are geared towards smaller scope adventures.
Mm-hmm. And when thinking about the scope, you do have to think about, you know, not only the linear storytelling bits, what is the beginning, what is the middle, what is the end, what's like the big high note that you want to hit on, like what's the final encounter, like thinking in terms of those moments, but also because you're thinking in terms of a tabletop role-playing game, you know, you're thinking in terms of game design. My biggest piece of advice on that is don't think in a straight line. Like I keep saying, you know, the point A to point B to point C adventure outline, but really, you know, because this is a game that you want your players to be interacting with and having that like freedom of choice, you should think more in terms of like a flow chart. Like even if you have an incredibly simple adventure, you know, it's like a 5-room dungeon or something like that, where it's like whatever events are going to happen are going to be contained within this dungeon, you should still think of like, all right, if they go into this room, there's a possibility that they do this, or they go through like this door first instead of this door, or they kill this person, or they befriend this person, and if so, what happens once they go to here. Like very much the if and kind of statement kind of thinking.
Yeah, if this is something that's new to you, if you haven't really played a lot of role-playing games that are structured like this, if you haven't played video games where because there's video games, of course, where your actions have consequences and different things will happen based off of how you, the character, proceeds in the video games. But if you haven't experienced any of that, if the idea of the flowchart and they took option B instead of option A, how do I deal with this? I am being so serious when I say go to the library and get one of the choose your own adventure books out of the kids section and read it, because those books are the flowchart and there are different consequences based off of the decisions you make. And I was absolutely one of those kids who would take a stack of choose your own adventure books and a stack of sticky notes and mark every single fork in the road so that I could go back and find every single ending. And this is a lot of why I am the way that I am these days. But if this is new to you, if you've never experienced that or designed something around that, seriously, go check out a Choose Your Own Adventure book and see that's an easy example of choices and forks in the roads and flowchart storytelling, and they're quick and easy to read. Or you could, I think Netflix has that one Choose Your Own Adventure movie, but yeah, I mean, some of us are familiar with it and some of us aren't, and it could be kind of difficult to sort of plot something that isn't strictly linear. So yeah, that's an example. Go read one of those, and that'll give you some ideas.
The asterisk I would put on that statement is that choose your own adventure books are notoriously deadly.
Yeah.
So they are very great if you're playing like an OSR game where it's like, yeah, this is going to be high lethality, because then it's like, oh, I went through this door and now my soul is going to be rent for eternity.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be every door you give your players doesn't have to be death and destruction if they don't pick the quote unquote right one. But, just as an example of fork in the roads, And if you have things that you want, well, Kevin, what is your advice when you have a place that you want us to get to? How would you say that you manipulate us to get us there?
I give you a reason to go there. Like, I have
There you go. It's that simple.
I have a lot of tools in my tool belt for that kind of thing. Like, you hear a rumor from some townspeople, or you have like an NPC who's part of the party who, just like casually says like, hey, maybe we should go over to this place. I don't know, guys. It's up to you. Or, I have a villain like come in and steal something and be like, haha, if you want this back, meet me at this place. Or, tried and true, there's a treasure map and a little dotted line and an X right over that big place.
And we love treasure.
Yeah.
Oh my God, do we love treasure.
Yeah.
But there's gotta be, listen, here's the thing though, I will say, make sure the treasure is good. Kevin always gives us good treasure. I got a lightsaber recently. I was thrilled. The thing about magic items, and I think this kind of goes into world building and scope, magic items, and this can be, I'm using the term magic items, but this could go beyond D&D. It could go into super special treasure that boosts your character, whether it's gold or a laser gun or whatever. That can be difficult for GMs because it can be difficult to balance. And it can be difficult when your characters get greedy and they want all sorts of treasures and you keep giving them these power-ups and gold, and then you cause inflation in the small towns they go to because they pour so much money into the economy, and health potions are so cheap to them because they have so much gold. Or these monsters are easy for them to kill. It's harder for you, the GM, to present a challenge because now they can just one-shot these monsters with all of these powerful things you gave them because you wanted to give them these cool and interesting magical items as rewards for playing through the adventures. And, you can always drop a Tarrasque on them to humble them if you need to. But you can kind of parse it out, and with treasures, start small in the beginning. If you give them small things that are still valuable. There are lots of cool magic items that don't require attunement that players can have fun with. When you're low level, a healing potion is really valuable, and you can just give them a few healing potions and they'll be thrilled because they have 8 hit points and they almost died fighting a goblin. You can start small and then build into these larger near world breaking items. But yeah, it's economy of scale is pretty important as you go into your world building and through your adventure. And the other thing too is if you're playing a short adventure, don't save those cool magic items as their reward for like winning the one shot, because it's like, oh yeah, you went through this labyrinth and you fought all of these enemies and you beat all of the other teams and you got to the center of the labyrinth and you won a staff of power. Congratulations. Okay. That's the end of the session. I'm glad everybody had a great time. Okay, it's Pete's turn to DM next time. I'll see you all next Saturday for that adventure. Because now all of the players are like, what? Give them the staff of the power like halfway through and then let them fight a dragon with it as the climax,
Mm-hmm.
Give them stuff so that they can use it. If the goal of the 1-shot or the 3-shot or whatever is to get to some sort of treasure hoard, you could just make all of that gold and they'll be happy that they won all of this meaningless gold, and their character, well, it's not meaningless, but I mean meaningless in the sense of like the session is over now, the game is over now, and the characters can describe the dream vacation they went on because it's wish fulfillment with all of this gold. But if you're going to give them mechanical magical items as rewards, do it so that they have time to use them in game.
And it's interesting that you bring up items because, you can fill out as much world building as you want. You can have a Google Doc in the 3 digits of all the different info that you have on this world. And some people are more inclined to think of in terms of like, I just want to fill out all of the spaces before we play in this world. And that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, if that's enrichment for you, that's fine.
But there's a lot of different ways to then give the players that world building. As you said, there's, you can give world building through the items. That's what the FromSoft games are notoriously known for. Or, like in Dungeons and Dragons, it's like you pick up the cursed hand of Vecna, and it's suddenly like, oh, who's Vecna? And like,
who's this Vecna guy? Yeah, I want to know him. How'd he lose his hand?
Exactly.
Does he want it back? Is he coming for us?
And you can have like an NPC from a faction who like explicitly tells, the characters like, here's the bits of exposition. But there's also environmental storytelling where it's like you walk into a city and there's a bunch of different flags of the nation that they're in and a bunch of different, like you can do it, buy war bonds posters. And that says a lot about like the world of the town they're going in versus if they go into town and there's like no visible flags or something like that.
Yeah, I want to go back on environments real quick. That's actually, if you need your adventurers to, maybe you've led them to a small town where there's some sort of hook and they miss the hook either through their own role playing or through bad rolls or whatever. Like they just missed that clue that you need them to take and they're about to leave town. Oh no, they can't because now it's like thunderstorm, there's a weather watch, like they've got a lockdown in town. They have to stay overnight now, and that kind of gives you time to maybe get that hook out there. Like you can have weather happen. That stops travel. It'll trap people. If you need to keep them there, you can do environmental concerns over things like bandits suddenly flood the town. There are lots of ways to progress story that is not through combat. As much as I love combat, there are different options and different ways to challenge your players. Puzzles are also good. Give them puzzles to work through. If you need puzzle ideas, ones that are made for like second graders seem to be very effective. Listen, we're not always the smartest.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, like, weather is another way of world building. Like, if this is a town that has a lot of sandstorms, well, you kind of need to develop how the town deals with the sandstorms, or the constant thunderstorms, or the drought, or, the 5 suns in the sky. All the different world building things link into each other.
And if you want to look at how weather affects world building, again, I'm being so serious with my silly little suggestion. Look at America, because the country of America has some of the most insane weather variations in the world, because North America specifically is such an interesting little continent, geographically speaking. And you could really kind of dig into the science of all of it to figure out like why America has so much extreme weather in comparison to other parts of the globe, and why America has so much extreme weather concentrated in this area, because of course other places have massive sandstorms or massive hurricanes or things like that, but there's not a ton of countries that have hurricanes and sandstorms and wildfires and floods and tornadoes and earthquakes and searing blizzards and extreme droughts the way that America has all of this in one country. It's not all in one region though, and the way that Americans will regionally interact with weather or talk about weather or their experiences can be a good idea to give you, the GM, ideas of how different people in different areas are going to interact with weather.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Kevin is from the East Coast and the Midwest. I am from the Western US. I grew up in Arizona and I've lived in California for several years. I did spend some time in the mountains in college, so I am familiar with snow and blizzards, but I did not spend my entire childhood dealing with snow and blizzards. And even then, Flagstaff's weather is really weird in comparison to other places of America where there's a lot of snowfall. It's not like the Midwest, the Great Lakes region, where you are basically living in the ninth circle of hell where it's a frozen lake for 6 months of the year. I grew up with 110 being a perfectly reasonable number. You saw that on the forecast and you're like, oh, it's only 110 today. Maybe we'll go outside for 15 minutes. Kevin's shaking his head in dismay. He's never understood
That's too much.
Any of that. Yeah. So think about like Kevin, what did you do in the summer when you were growing up as a kid?
Well, I mean, I played outside, of course, but I was sort of just used to like a 80 to 90 with high humidity kind of heat, which sucked. But as long as you're kind of like going into that knowing that it's going to suck, you know, it's like, all right, I'm going to play some football and then afterward I'm going to be drenched in sweat. But a dry 110 is just, that's just uncomfortable.
No, I did not. There was, when I grew up in the summers in Arizona, and summer was like from May to September, pretty much, maybe into April or October, depending. You only went outside if you were swimming, really. The pool would be like 85 to 90 degrees, which is very, very warm. And at a certain point, it's not super refreshing. And also, we still weren't allowed to go out from like 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. during the height of the sun. You know, that was an indoor thing. So if you're in a really hot climate, think about how these people, they spend a lot of time indoors. Their outdoor season is in the winter when it's like 60 to 70 degrees. You know, they maybe they're more nocturnal during the summer. They come out at night when it's cooler. They stay indoors. You know, how do they interact? The winters of the Midwest, insane to me. Why would you deal with that? I don't understand. You don't have to shovel sunshine.
I mean, I moved, so I don't have to deal with that anymore.
Yeah, exactly. That's why everybody lives in California. Because the weather is pretty nice. Yes, there's lots of wildfires. How do we cope with that? Air filters and masks. Like, that's another example. Like, if you have characters that live in a place where there's a lot of wildfires, what are their coping mechanisms for this? So that's just kind of another little nugget, is how is weather affecting this town? How might it affect your characters? There are, for example, D&D modules that deal with a lot of like survival mechanics, because you have characters that are in really extreme environments. And sometimes, you know, I think kind of generally there's a little bit of a lackadaisical attitude towards that whole 10 rations a day thing in D&D. Like, we usually kind of ignore it, / it's not super relevant because we tend to hit up a lot of like pubs and inns in our adventures. Like, we haven't, in the modules that we have played, Kevin, I don't think it's ever really come up as a big thing, but I know we're looking to play Icewind Dale at some point, and that is an adventure that is really built in the survival mechanics. It's part of it that you have to give a shit about that.
And that's the kind of last thing I want to go into in, you know, talking about world building and scope, is that the way that your players uncover this world building is oftentimes influenced by the mechanics. And through the game mechanics is another way that you can fill out the world building. We talked about magic items earlier and how each of the items or loot that you give to your party can also have bits of world building lore attached to it. Like, just being able to find a gun in a dungeon says a lot about your world building, especially if they're in a fantasy world where they previously did not have guns. But also the way that the players interact with the world is through its mechanics. If the game you're playing has mechanics for uncovering a lot of information and investigating mysteries and talking to a lot of different people at once, then they're going to uncover a lot of the details of the world building through that. But if all of the mechanics are mostly focused on combat, then the way that the players are going to be mostly experiencing the world is through the things that they fight, the monsters or the factions or, you know, whatever gets in their way. And we talk about how weather is also a large world building detail. If weather is going to be a large part of the game that you're playing, then it makes sense to have mechanics for for that weather. What if the party goes out into the giant thunderstorm? Like, how does that affect them? Or like you were saying, like, there are some mechanics that you ignore because they're not really important to the game you're playing, but if you're running a game where like survival is important or scavenging is important or having enough money to buy rations is important, then you want to play out, you know, the ration and eating mechanics, because that is another way that your players experience the world.
And that could be a good motivator for them to take jobs. If you're like, no, you guys have to pay for your food. Like, you need to pay for rations. You're going on a 10-day trek into the woods to this ancient tomb to uncover a sword. You have to eat on the way there. And some classes and characters will have inbuilt mechanics that make it very easy. Maybe they're going to feed themselves with magic. Maybe they're like survivalists. They're like rangers or whatever, and they can scrounge up all of the food. That's fine. If they're not, then what are they doing about it? You know, it's kind of okay to put in some of that minutiae into the game because it's another way to challenge the players. It's a little bit flexible, sort of, the little details that are going to matter. You know, people rarely describe, like, okay, now my character is going to go behind those bushes and take a shit. Typically, any time that has ever come up in our game, it's the same way that it comes up in movies and TV, where it happens for plot-relevant reasons. Somebody's like, I gotta go to the bathroom, so that it leaves two other characters to have time to talk about a private moment or something like that. Or one of our games, the party, wanted to go to a spa. And I, as a player, find spas to be pointless in D&D. Like, it was obviously a sentiment of wish fulfillment for one of the players. They really wanted their character to go to a spa, and they wanted to spend their pretend money pretending to have a spa situation experience. That's totally fine and cool. I was like, I'm not spending my pretend money on this pretend spa experience. I don't even spend money on real spa experiences. So my character was alone in the bar waiting for everybody, and Kevin used that as a golden opportunity to get the jump on my character because they were all alone. So it's like you can kind of have those little opportunities and moments, and so presenting potential distractions like that in your world building, like spas or bars or shopping sprees or things like that, those could be good ways to kind of isolate the party a little bit, because you're going to have some characters that are maybe interested in it and some characters that are less interested in it, and then you can get at characters.
But an interesting thing to drop into this scenario, though, is would you have been more interested in checking out the spa if it conferred a mechanical benefit? If it was like, if you go to the spa, you get 20 temporary hit points.
Yes,
then
absolutely.
Yeah, so then suddenly you're more interested in checking out the spa and that bit of the world, because it's conferring a more mechanical benefit. And that's like the last bit of advice that I would give. If you really want your players to like explore the world and like really delve into it, make the interesting parts of your world building playable.
Yeah.
And it is amazing how many official products I see that don't get this right. If you have guns in your world, make them usable. If you have spaceships, make them drivable. Hey, not naming any names, but if you're coming out with a big product that's like, hey, you can drive spaceships in space, and then you don't have rules for driving the spaceships in space, you're kind of lying. And I don't care about the spaceships now.
Yeah.
If there's aliens in your world, either make them playable or have the players fight them. Let me play with the interesting thing, and I'll care more about why it's interesting.
Absolutely. And one of the things too, like, part of the reason, to continue talking about the spa, part of the reason that spa was there was, and now, actually, well, let me ask, was the spa in the module?
And this is Descent into Avernus?
Yeah, Descent into Avernus.
Yeah, the spa's the module. There's multiple spas in Descent into Avernus.
Yes, there's spas in the module that were expensive and they did not confer a mechanical benefit, right?
Yeah.
Okay. However, they still attracted some of the players in our party. I mean, you knew, like, oh, yeah, Gwen's gonna love this. Because Gwen would. Like, that's her personality. And so all this to say is, like, your world building can be influenced by the players at your table. You can think about, like, Pete's gonna be really into this, but Marcy, she may not. But I want to give Pete the thing, so what can I do for Marcy, and whether it is giving that real, because spas in the real world, people benefit from them, like physically and psychologically or whatever. Mm-hmm. But in the game world, it's all pretend. So unless there's like a hard mechanical benefit, sometimes players are not going to go for it. Sometimes it does represent, though, like an RP session. Like everybody had, a lot of this party went to the spa day and did like a little bit of RP and it was like a bonding moment for the party, and that was emotionally mechanically resonant, you know? And it wasn't just like my character didn't just sit out because I was like, this is pointless. My character also was like a goblin. It was like, I'm not interested in spa. Like, you know, there was like a little bit, if I was playing a character that wanted to go to a spa, even if Kayla's like, this is a waste of money, I'll stay true to the character. The character will go to the spa. But the character I was playing also wasn't interested in it. And what Kevin did was he weaponized that moment. But, you know, that there's other examples of that, of you can, like, be like, okay, sit tight 1 second. Like, these guys are going to go to a spa. They're going to RP it. All this says, like, your players, it's collaborative. Your players can influence the world building in the sense of you can think, like, what is so-and-so going to find interesting? What button is so-and-so going to pick? And lay that out there as rewards or traps for them.
So I think I already said, like, this is my last tip, but for realsies, this is my last tip of this episode. If you're not a GM at the table, if you're writing an RPG setting or you're writing an adventure and you want to do world building without having the players at the table to collaboratively world build with you, one of the best ways to build out a world mechanically is through random tables. I love reading modules or RPG settings where it's like, here's this town and here's 25 random events that can happen in this town, because that is also just a smorgasbord of like, here's stuff that can happen in this world. Whether it's like you walk down the street and you see 3 people getting mugged by 8 people, or you walk down the street and you see this shop hawking like a strange food, like lizard on a stick or something like that. You can pepper in all these different world building things through these small events and random tables. So I always encourage, if you're writing like professional RPG products, to put in as many random tables as you can, because that's me as a GM reading all of the different options. I get a much broader view of the world that I can then pepper into the players. Like I can pick and choose the bits that I find interesting, or RAW actually roll on the table for these events. And then that's another mechanical way to experience the world.
Yes, and having tables, to go back to the beginning when I talked about tools for world building very quickly or on the fly when players open a door you kind of didn't expect them to, having tables on hand is really helpful for that, of like, oh shit, I didn't think about what might be behind this door. Let me pull up a random encounter table of some kind or whatever, or roll like a random item that's in there. And there are resources out there for GMs that are basically like random tables for any sort of situation that your players might come up with. You know, whether it's just food at the pub, because you're like, I'm not going to think about what this pub is eating, but the characters are asking, or what this pub is serving, but the characters are asking. Roll it. Hoagies. They serve hoagies. Deal with it, you know?
Random food tables, random name tables, random encounter tables, random treasure tables. Random tables are a GM's best friend. And if you're writing an official work, put those in there. If you're playing the game as a GM, just have a few tabs open to random tables when you need it. It's a great way to fill out your world when you did not fill out the world in advance.
And there are NPC tables, too, where you can quickly roll up an NPC. Chris Perkins made his random NPC names available on the internet for people to see. Like, he's got a list of orc names and he has a list of halfling names and things like that for him to just grab on the fly if he needs to, instead of having to be like, shit, this NPC doesn't have a name, and suddenly they're talking to them. It's like, look down. Okay, his name is Carl. Like, you know, you can just have that in your GM binder, whether you nab one that's available on the internet for people to use or you make one yourself. You can have these things kind of in the back of the binder.
So, big summary of what we talked about. You need to think about the broader world building as well as the narrow scope of what you are playing. With world building, think about the genre that you're in for inspiration, look into history for inspiration, look into what parts of the world are interesting to you, and then build out from there. Think about what parts of the world are interesting to your players and then build out from there. You don't need everything filled out. You just need the parts that you're going to use. There are so many different sources for inspiration when it comes to world building. The biggest source of inspiration being the world around you.
Yeah.
But At the same time, while you're thinking about world building, think about your scope. What's the beginning, middle, and end? What's sort of the adventure outline flow chart, like the different areas that you expect the players to hit? Think about your if ands of like, if the players are here and they do this, how does that affect this? Versus if they do this, how does that affect this? And also think about the scale of your story. Is it small town romance or is it galaxy-wide space opera? And then think about the mechanics that the players will be experiencing this world through, because that is another way to build out the world building. If rations are important, why is that important to the story that you're trying to tell? And if you have cool laser guns, are the laser guns playable? If you have big weather, what happens when the players interact with the big weather? If you have a game that is only focused on violence, then know that that is how the players will interact with the world, is through violence. Like all these different things to think of when you're thinking of the wider world and the scope of your adventure. So, Kayla, can you sound us off?
Yeah, sure. I would love to. So, audience, let us know. Do you enjoy playing smaller scope adventures in small towns, or do you like the bigger, epic world-saving quests? If you've played multiple higher level campaigns, do you enjoy the reset back to the lower levels, or is it frustrating for you? Do you prefer lower levels or higher levels? Let us know. If you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, leave a comment, and share with a friend. Follow us on social media. We got links in the show notes. We also have a Ko-fi. You can support us there and get access to cool bonus content like extra episodes, access to the private Discord, etc. Check it out. Writing for Roleplay is a production of Digital Kaiju Studios. It is hosted and produced by Kevin Carpenter and Kayla Knutson. It is edited mostly by Kevin because Kayla is a personality hire. We post a new episode every Tuesday. See you next week!